On the surface, it looks like one of the world's most defiant new alliances, right? You've got an energy-rich nation, Iran, under crushing sanctions, and a global superpower, China, that's challenging the world order. But the real story of China and Iran is so much more complex. It's this high-stakes game of mutual need, deep suspicion, and some really calculated strategy. Okay, let's dive into this.
So publicly, on the world stage, the support is unmistakable. At a time when Iran is facing some really intense pressure and isolation from the West, China is consistently there, providing diplomatic cover. Beijing makes it a point to say that this relationship is a top diplomatic priority. It's a clear signal to everyone that, hey, Iran is not alone. But what does being a top priority actually look like in practice?
Well, it all revolves around this grand vision, a huge strategic partnership that's supposed to tie these two countries together for a whole generation. The idea is to create this powerful economic and military bloc that can push back against Western influence.
And the centerpiece? It's just a staggering number. A promised $400 billion in Chinese investment over 25 years. I mean, think about that. The plan sets aside $280 billion for Iran's oil and gas sectors, and another $120 billion to completely overhaul its transportation and manufacturing. We're talking about a figure that could totally transform Iran's entire economy.
And the way this deal is structured, it's pretty fascinating. In exchange for all that promised cash, China gets the one thing it needs more than anything: a steady, reliable supply of oil, and at a heavy discount. But the pact also goes deeper, calling for more military cooperation, joint training, intelligence sharing, you name it. And it officially plugs Iran into China's massive global project, the Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay, so that's the big picture, the grand vision. But how does this relationship actually work day to day, especially with all these U.S. sanctions designed to basically cripple Iran's economy? Well, this is where the partnership gets really, really creative, and it's become an absolutely vital economic lifeline for Tehran.
And wow, this chart right here, it just perfectly sums up the heart of the matter. That red area, that's oil exports to China. The tiny gray sliver, that's the rest of the world. Since 2021, China has become, for all intents and purposes, the only major buyer of Iranian oil. We're talking about 80 to 90% of all of Iran's seaborne exports.
And to put a number on it, China has been importing an average of around 1.4 million barrels of Iranian crude per day. That flow of oil is the single most important thing keeping Iran's economy from completely collapsing. So, the billion-dollar question is, how on earth are they getting away with it?
Well, they pull it off using a couple of really clever mechanisms. The first one is something called teapot refineries. These are basically smaller, semi-independent refineries in China. And because they aren't these huge state-owned giants, they're not as exposed to the U.S. financial system. That makes them much, much harder for Washington to track and sanction. They quietly buy up that discounted Iranian oil and often just rebrand it as coming from someplace like Malaysia to hide where it's really from.
And then there's the second piece of the puzzle, the so-called dark fleet. This is essentially a secret network of older oil tankers, often with really murky ownership. What they do is turn off their transponders, the system that broadcasts their location, making them basically invisible to satellite tracking, as they sneak that sanctioned oil across the ocean.
But it's not just about oil. To get around all the banking sanctions, they've gone back to one of the oldest forms of trade in human history: barter. For example, the Chinese carmaker Chery ships parts to Iran. The cars get assembled and sold there. But instead of paying in dollars, Iran just sends containers of raw materials, like copper and zinc, back to China. The whole thing happens completely outside the US dollar system. Pretty smart, right?
So let's recap. We've got this massive $400 billion promise, and this really sophisticated, sanctions-proof system for trade. It sounds like a perfect partnership. But this is where the plot thickens, because when you look closer, you find this huge paradox right at the heart of the whole alliance.
And this brings us to the central question, the big mystery here. If China is so committed and all this oil is flowing, why are Iran's most critical infrastructure projects, the very projects this partnership was supposed to fund, just sitting there, completely stalled with almost no money?
Yeah, and this table, it really lays out the hard truth. Take a look at the Rasht-Astara Railway, a super important link. Cost? About 1.6 billion euros. Funding from partners? Zero. Nothing. What about the Chabahar-Zahedan Railway? Iran is having to fund what little progress there is from its own pocket. Another deal for Chinese financing was signed, but the money never showed up. So that Great Wall of money? It's looking more like a Great Wall of, well, nothing.
So what gives? Why is China holding back? Well, it all comes down to some cold, hard business sense. First, Chinese state banks are businesses, not charities. They are not going to pour money into super high-risk projects unless Iran can give them credible financial guarantees, which it can't. Second, China's biggest companies are deeply connected to the global dollar economy, and they are terrified of getting hit with U.S. sanctions. And finally, here's the kicker. Many of Iran's big projects actually compete with China's own priority routes for its Belt and Road Initiative.
You see, this huge gap between what's promised and what's actually happening, it tells us everything about China's real strategy here. This isn't about building Iran up into some powerful new partner. No, it's about playing a much longer, much more subtle game.
This quote from Chatham House just nails it. You shouldn't mistake Beijing's hesitation for unreliability. It's a calculated strategy. The whole point is to achieve China's own long-term goals. And a lot of the time, that means letting the U.S. spend its own energy and resources dealing with problems.
So if you want to understand what's really going on, you have to look at China's actual goals. Beijing wants an Iran that is weak enough to be dependent on China, but not so weak that its government collapses. Why? Because a simmering crisis in the Middle East keeps the U.S. completely distracted and bogged down far away from China's backyard in the Indo-Pacific. And all the while, China gets the cheap oil it needs and avoids a massive war that would mess up its own energy supplies.
And you can see this two-faced approach perfectly when you look at the nuclear issue. Publicly, China always defends Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy. But behind closed doors, Beijing is really worried. A nuclear-armed Iran could set off a crazy arms race in the region, which would threaten all of China's huge business deals in the Gulf. It might even push rivals like Japan or South Korea to get nukes of their own.
Okay, let's zoom out for a second. This whole paradoxical partnership is more than just about two countries. It's kind of a test case, maybe even a blueprint for how a parallel economic system can actually work completely outside the traditional Western-led world order.
And look, this is why this whole thing matters to all of us. This axis of evasion, with its dark fleets and its barter deals, it's showing other sanctioned countries how they can survive. It's a direct challenge to the power of Western sanctions and, really, to the dominance of the U.S. dollar itself.
So what's the bottom line here? What should you take away from all this? Well, the China-Iran relationship isn't some deep alliance of friends. It's a very practical, very transactional partnership. China gets cheap energy and a way to keep the U.S. busy. Iran gets an economic lifeline and a diplomatic shield. Each side gets what it needs, and not a penny more.
Which leaves us with a final, huge question. This partnership is a model, and you can bet other countries are watching very closely. As these parallel systems of trade and finance get bigger and more sophisticated, are we actually witnessing the beginning of the end for the dollar's dominance around the world?